Have you ever had your own child look you in the eyes and say, "Apologize," or "Leave my house"? Sounds like a line from a movie, doesn't it? But that's precisely what happened to me last night. My son, the only child I devoted my entire life to raising, stared straight into my eyes and said those words. For a few seconds, I couldn't breathe. All I could think was, did I really raise my son to become this kind of person? Before I tell you the whole story, hit subscribe, because some stories aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to remind us of what truly matters in life. Now, let me take you back to that night. I used to think I'd seen it all. Loss, the long years of scraping by with bills, raising a child alone, learning how to smile even when life wasn't kind. I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. Until last night, at the lavish dinner party in my son's new home. It was supposed to be a warm evening, a mother reuniting with her son, sharing in his happiness. But within just a few hours, that dinner changed everything. Because right there, in that room filled with laughter and glowing lights, I realized something about family, about love, something that no amount of money or fine wine could ever buy. And from that moment on, the real story began. I arrived at Daniel's house on a chilly afternoon, with the river wind carrying the scent of salt and mist. His mansion sat right on the edge of the Charleston River, a grand white house with a black tiled roof and glass walls that caught the fiery red of the setting sun. The iron gate opened slowly, as if on purpose, giving me time to admire the new world my son now belonged to. I had never stepped into a place so luxurious. The ceiling was so high that if you let go of a balloon, you'd need a ladder to get it back. A crystal chandelier hung above, shimmering like stars trapped in glass. Every step I took echoed across the polished marble floor, reflecting my figure, small and slightly out of place. A man in a black uniform smiled politely. "Good evening, ma'am. May I take your coat?" I nodded, murmuring thanks, though something inside me felt heavy. At home, I was accustomed to hanging my coat behind the door and pouring my own glass of water. Here, even the smiles felt foreign. The living room was crowded. Guests dressed elegantly, talking in the language of the wealthy. Stocks, new projects, vacations in Italy, which interior designer was trending. I sat down on a velvet chair, fingering my glass of wine, trying to start a conversation with the woman next to me. She talked passionately about her vintage car collection, then about her summer trip to Santorini. I just nodded and smiled politely, wondering to myself, what am I doing here? Then Veronica appeared, the new bride of the house, the woman Daniel loved so deeply. She wore a cream silk dress, tight-fitting, graceful yet distant. Every movement she made seemed deliberate, every smile carefully measured. She moved through the crowd like a queen, a wine glass in hand, her lips curved in perfect social grace. "Margaret, so happy you could make it," she said, leaning in to kiss my cheek, that kind of polite, practiced greeting. I smiled back sincerely, but she had already turned to someone else, introducing the appetizers imported from France and the authentic Italian cheese. Everything in that house was imported, from the silverware and vases to the faint fragrance in the air. I thought to myself that if anyone asked, Veronica would probably say that even the air here was imported from Europe. Daniel was busy greeting guests. My grown man, now wore a tailored suit, a glass of wine in hand, speaking fluently about numbers and contracts. I watched him with pride tinged by pain. In his eyes, I no longer saw the carefree spark of his youth. They now held the weary shine of a man trying to balance love, ambition, and image. I moved toward the table, meaning to help the waiter with the dishes. But Veronica gently stopped me, her voice soft. "No, please. You're our guest." It sounded polite, but her eyes carried another message. "Don't touch anything." I froze for a second, then smiled faintly. I was only trying to help. No need, Mom. Just sit and relax, Daniel added quickly. I sat down, awkward and out of place. In that grand house, surrounded by clinking silverware and polite laughter, I felt like a stranger at someone else's party. Veronica walked by, adjusting wine glasses and asking the staff to dim the lights a bit. She whispered something to Daniel, and he nodded in response. Then they both looked at me. For a brief second, there was a flicker of tension. Fleeting, but enough for me to know I didn't belong in the perfect picture they were trying to paint. I took a sip of wine. The bitterness slid down my throat. In my mind, I saw flashes of our old dinners, just me and Daniel sitting at a small table, eating simple stew, laughing about little things. No crystal glasses, no chandeliers, but so much warmth. Now here I was, surrounded by dazzling lights and expensive perfume, feeling emptier than ever. I tried to smile, to act like I was fine, but deep down I could feel a distance growing between me and my son. It wasn't just the distance of age or lifestyle, it was the distance between values, the ones I had taught him and the ones he seemed to have forgotten. The sound of silverware gently clinking against porcelain mixed with quiet laughter and polite chatter. Dinner began with an appetizer so elaborate that it took me a few seconds to figure out what exactly was on my plate. Veronica stood up, poised like a professional host. She smiled, holding up a bottle of amber-colored wine that shimmered under the lights. "This is a very special wine," she said proudly. "It's imported directly from a small vineyard in Tuscany. Very rare. Hardly sold anywhere." The guests around the table gasped in admiration, nodding approvingly. A gray-haired man joked, "Daniel, you really spoil your wife. That bottle must have cost more than the watch I'm wearing." Everyone laughed. Then someone's gaze turned toward me. "Daniel's mother must be quite the wine connoisseur too, huh?" a young woman said playfully. I smiled softly and answered honestly, "I only drink a glass once in a while, usually after mowing the lawn. What keeps me awake isn't wine, it's a cold glass of lemonade." Laughter filled the room again, polite, shallow, and a bit strained. I lifted my glass and studied the label. The design looked oddly familiar. Italic letters, a vineyard sketch that didn't look much different from the ones sold at the grocery store near my house. I said, without thinking, with no bad intention at all, "That's funny. I swear I saw this bottle at Trader Joe's last week." The air froze. Laughter stopped. The only sound was a fork dropping onto a plate. Veronica stiffened, her smile hardened like glass. She set her glass down, her tone soft but cutting. "No, Mother. This one was imported exclusively. It's not sold in stores." Her eyes stayed on me, smiling but colder than the glass wall behind her. Daniel, sitting beside me, nudged my leg under the table. Just a light tap, but enough to say, "Mom, stop." I forced a chuckle, murmuring, "I was just joking. Must have been my mistake." No one said another word. The air turned heavy. Every second seemed longer than it should. The clink of glasses, the scrape of chairs, all of it sounded painfully clear. I took a slow breath, tried smiling at the guest across from me, but no one met my eyes. Veronica started talking about the main course, the beef cooked using an authentic Italian recipe. But her voice had lost its warmth. Daniel wouldn't look at me anymore. He spoke to the guest beside him, a stiff smile on his face before turning away. I bowed my head, trying to focus on the food, but nothing had any taste left. Inside, all I could feel was a chill, like someone had just slammed a door in my face. After the wine incident, the mood never recovered. Everyone tried to change the subject, but the laughter was paper thin. A woman with blonde hair sitting across from me attempted to lighten the atmosphere. "Daniel, I heard your mother used to be a librarian at the university, is that right?" Before Daniel could answer, Veronica jumped in smoothly. "Yes, that's right, but that was years ago. Now she just relaxes and enjoys her retirement." She smiled sweetly, but that single word, just, cut sharper than a knife. Just relaxing. I smiled and nodded. Yes, I'm retired now. It's nice, actually. I have time to garden and read. But my voice came out so soft I almost didn't recognize the tremor in it. Another guest, a man who had clearly had too much to drink, burst out laughing. That's adorable, my housekeeper used to love reading, too. The table laughed again, as if it were a compliment. I smiled, pretending not to mind, but inside, something cracked. Small, but unmistakable. I glanced at Daniel. He said nothing. He just inhaled quietly and turned away. My inner voice grew calm, almost cold. In that moment, I understood something. Tonight, I wasn't Daniel's mother. I was just a small detail in the picture they were trying to paint, a prop to make their story look perfect. I lifted my glass of water, took a sip to wash away the tightness in my throat, and under the warm, golden glow of the chandelier, for the first time, I saw it clearly. The distance between me and my son was no longer measured in feet, but in worlds. The party ended with short bursts of laughter and polite handshakes. Everyone tried to act cheerful, but I could tell no one truly was. One by one, the guests left, taking with them the suffocating tension that still lingered in the room full of lights. I stood by the window, staring out at the garden. Tiny string lights swayed in the wind. Beneath all that splendor, the house felt strangely silent. Somewhere behind me, I heard the soft clink of a glass, followed by Daniel's approaching footsteps. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice low and hoarse. "Can we talk for a minute?" I turned and looked at him. My son, the same boy who once laughed beside me through the hardest years of my life. Now his face was serious, colder than the crystal chandelier above us. He motioned for me to follow. We walked down a long hallway lined with framed photos, wedding pictures, vacations, the two of them dressed in luxury. Not a single one had me in it. Daniel opened a heavy wooden door, his study. The scent of polished oak and faint cologne filled the air. The walls were covered with awards, certificates, and framed contracts, trophies of what he called success. The door closed behind me. The space shrank, leaving only the two of us, mother and son, and the ticking clock marking the seconds towards something about to break. Daniel folded his arms and stood behind his desk, looking at me. "Veronica's very upset," he said evenly. "Tonight was really important to her. She invited a few investors, and you embarrassed her." I met his gaze and answered calmly, "Son, I was just joking. Everyone laughed during dinner, remember? At home, I used to joke through every meal." Daniel shook his head. "That's different. You can't talk like that here. You made her lose face in front of our guests." I frowned. Lose face? Over a joke about a bottle of wine? Do you really think that's more important than what's inside this family? He sighed, rubbing his temples. "You don't understand. Those people aren't just friends. They're partners, opportunities. Everything tonight had to be perfect. And you." He hesitated, avoiding my eyes. "You ruined that." I gave a sad smile. "You make it sound like I did it on purpose. You know I didn't mean to." He lifted his head, his tone firming. "Intentions don't matter, Mom. Results do. You hurt Veronica. She's been crying in the bathroom. You should apologize to her." I was silent for a few seconds, staring into his eyes. I saw exhaustion, pressure, and fear. Fear of judgment, fear of losing control. The look in his eyes wasn't the same as the look in the eyes of the little boy who used to run into my arms after school. It was the look of a man who had learned how to be afraid. "Son," I said softly, "I raised you to be honest, to speak the truth, not to be afraid of anyone. And now you're asking me to lie, just to please people?" He met my gaze. His voice was low but unwavering. "No, Mom. I'm asking you to do the right thing. You hurt my wife's feelings. You should apologize. There's nothing to argue about. I stepped closer and looked at him for a long moment. And if I don't? He swallowed hard, looked away, and spoke slowly, each word landing heavy on the wooden floor. Then you should go. Tonight. The room fell into complete silence. I could hear my heartbeat, slow, heavy, painful. I stood tall, saying nothing. A flash of memory came. Daniel at 10 years old, dirt on his cheeks, crying because he broke a vase. I had hugged him then and said, "It's okay, son. What matters is that you told the truth." And now, that same boy, the one I taught to be honest, was teaching me how to stay silent. My voice trembled as I spoke in my mind. I once taught my son to speak the truth without fear, but now, fear has taught him to forget it. I took a deep breath to steady myself. Daniel was staring at the floor, his fists clenched, as if even he regretted what he had just said. I nodded quietly. I understand. I turned toward the door, resting my hand on the knob. For a moment, I wanted to tell him I forgave him, that I knew he didn't mean it, that the pressures of life had changed him. But I didn't. Some words, if spoken too soon, hurt more than silence. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The clock behind me kept ticking, counting the widening distance between us. Before I turned the corner, I heard Daniel softly call after me. Then stop. And in my head, a single thought rang clear. If I have to apologize, I will, but not because I'm forced to, because I choose to do what's right in my own way. I sat alone in the room Daniel had just left. The door was closed, leaving a silence so thick I could hear the clock's hands shifting 1 second at a time. The warm glow of the desk lamp fell across a framed photo on the shelf. A picture of Daniel at 8 years old. In it, he was grinning widely, holding a paper kite in both hands as the wind lifted his blonde hair. I stared at it for a long time, and in that moment, everything came rushing back. The long walks home, the simple dinners, the nights I got. Up to check if he was tucked under his blanket, I remembered a summer afternoon years ago. Daniel had broken my favorite ceramic vase, the only keepsake from my mother. His hands trembled as he held the pieces, tears streaming down his cheeks. I sat beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "Son, telling the truth never breaks what really matters. It's only when you lie that you hurt others." He nodded, sobbing out an apology. I hugged him tightly, proud that he understood the value of honesty. And yet now, in this grand house, that same child was teaching me how to stay quiet, how to do things the way people expect. I didn't blame him. Life, money, and the illusion of success had made him forget who he once was. I wiped my tears and took a deep breath. My hands trembled, not from anger, but from the ache of realizing that even love sometimes requires pride. I stood and walked toward the mirror. The reflection staring back was that of an older woman, her eyes glistening but steady, her lips pressed tight to hold her composure. I looked straight at myself and whispered, "If I have to apologize, I will, but not for forgiveness, not to make anyone feel better. I'll do it to protect the only thing that still matters, the truth." I fixed my hair, smoothed my dress, and smiled, a quiet, calm, unshakable smile. The golden light hit Daniel's photo again, making his childlike face seem to glow. I looked at it and spoke softly, as if to him, "You used to be brave, my son. Brave enough to admit when you were wrong, brave enough to tell the truth. I believe that boy is still inside you. You've just lost your way, and tonight I'll help you find him again." I left the room, closing the door gently behind me. The hallway was still lit, faint laughter and soft music drifting from afar. I strolled, each step steady and sure. No more tears, no more trembling. Only one thing filled my heart, the peace of knowing I was about to do what was right. And so, I walked back toward the dining room, the place where it all began, and where I would end it, in my own way. The dining room was still bright under the crystal chandelier, but the noise had died down. The remaining guests murmured softly, awkwardly searching for topics to fill the heavy air. The sound of a spoon touching a glass was so clear that I felt as though I were standing in a quiet church. I walked in. The sound of my heels on the wooden floor echoed steadily. And strangely, after just a few steps, every head turned toward me. The scattered conversations faded. Only the soft background jazz remained, a gentle tune that suddenly felt distant, as if it belonged to another world. Veronica sat at the head of the table. Her face no longer smiled. Her eyes were red, mascara smudged by tears. In her hand, she still clutched a white napkin, dabbing at her eyes like someone who had just endured a great tragedy. Daniel stood nearby, his face tense, his fists clenched. As I approached, I saw him swallow hard, his gaze avoiding mine. I stopped in the middle of the room, surrounded by stares, curious, cautious, and perhaps a little pitying. The air was thick enough to touch. I took a slow breath and spoke clearly, my voice calm and even, but loud enough for everyone to hear each word. "Veronica," I began, "I'm sorry." I heard a quiet sigh somewhere at the table. Someone relieved, thinking I had finally surrendered. But I continued, my tone steady. "I'm sorry. That you feel you have to buy love with glitter and gold instead of building it with trust." The room fell utterly silent, as if the air itself had been pulled out. I turned toward Daniel, my voice neither angry nor sharp, just sad and firm. "And I'm sorry, too, that my son has forgotten the home he was born into, a home where kindness, honesty, and love were worth more than anything money could ever buy." No one moved. The chandelier gave a faint crackle, as though it too was listening. Veronica froze, eyes wide. Her mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no sound came. Real tears, not rehearsed ones, began rolling down her cheeks. I strolled toward her, each step slicing through the silence. Standing before her, I softened my voice, gentle and sincere. "My dear, you don't have to prove anything. You don't have to become someone else. You are enough, enough to be loved, enough to be valued, as long as you are honest." Veronica stared at me, lips trembling. She placed a hand over her chest, tears falling onto the tablecloth. Behind her, Daniel's shoulders shook, his lips pressed tight as if to hold something back. I looked around the table. The guests were motionless. An older woman gave the faintest nod. From the corner of the room, someone whispered, "She's right." A man lifted his glass thoughtfully, his eyes reflective. I knew then that I wasn't speaking just for myself, but for all of them too, for everyone who had spent their lives wearing polite masks, hiding their exhaustion and fear of being judged. I took another deep breath. In my mind, my own voice spoke softly. "For years, I believed that love and kindness would naturally find their place. But sometimes, you have to speak up, to remind the world that honesty is never a mistake." I gently placed my hand on Veronica's shoulder. My gaze carried no anger, only forgiveness. She bowed her head and began to sob. Daniel stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. When our eyes met, I saw, for the first time in years, genuine remorse in my son's face. He bowed his head slightly and whispered, voice trembling, "Mom." I didn't answer. I simply smiled, faintly, peacefully, then turned to the guests and said softly as a breeze, "A family isn't a place to show off perfection. It's a place where we're allowed to be wrong, to be weak, and to be loved anyway." The air seemed to lighten. The music became clearer, though no one spoke. Some bowed their heads. Some smiled faintly. Veronica sat still, gripping her napkin tightly, occasionally lifting it to wipe her tears. I walked back to my seat, slow and calm, as though I'd just laid down a burden I'd been carrying for years. I took a sip of water. My heart felt lighter. as if I had just restored a missing piece of the house that had long been cracked. The room remained quiet, but it no longer felt cold. In that silence, something had changed. Small, but true. An older man leaned toward the woman beside him and murmured, "I think this house just found its soul again." I bowed my head slightly, then lifted my gaze. Daniel's eyes met mine. Between us, no words were needed, but we both understood. Some wounds exist only to remind us that love is still alive. In the days after the dinner, Daniel and Veronica's riverside mansion felt different. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was the kind of heavy quiet that hung like a thick fog over everything. News of the mother-in-law versus daughter-in-law showdown spread quickly among Veronica's circle of friends. One person retold it, another added a few more details for drama, and soon the story found its way into afternoon teas, group chats, and even the break rooms of Daniel's business associates. One major partner who had attended the dinner sent Daniel an email postponing their next meeting. "We'll reconnect when things settle down," it read. Short, polite, and enough for Daniel to understand the message behind it. Veronica barely spoke. She stayed in her room all day, avoiding her husband, avoiding phone calls. Each time Daniel knocked, all he heard was, "I'm tired." At night, the vast house was filled only with the sound of wind brushing past the porch and the faint glow from Daniel's office. He sat alone at his desk, staring at his still full glass of wine and the silent phone before him. Unanswered calls, unread messages, and his mother's silence. Inside him, something had gone missing. It wasn't a deal, nor his reputation. It was peace. One morning, Veronica quietly entered Daniel's study. Her eyes were ringed with fatigue, her hair hastily tied, her face pale, but somehow lighter than it had been in days. "Daniel," she said softly, "we need to talk." He looked up, about to speak, but she continued first. "I know I was wrong." She sat down, hands clasped tightly. "I've spent so long trying to make everyone believe I was perfect, that I was born into wealth, that I belonged in their world. But the truth is..." She lifted her eyes, glistening with tears. "I wasn't born rich. My parents were just ordinary workers. I used to wait tables in a cafe to pay for college. I've always been terrified of being looked down on, of people laughing if they found out I didn't belong." A small, sad smile crossed her lips. "When your mother said those words in front of everyone, I felt humiliated. But not because she was wrong, because she was right. I just couldn't face it." Daniel stayed silent. Each word she spoke peeled away the layers of the image they had built together. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she whispered. "I was just scared. Scared of not being enough. Scared you'd be ashamed of me." Daniel stood, stepped closer, and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. His voice cracked. "I was never ashamed of you. I was ashamed that I let my mother face all that alone." Tears streamed down Veronica's cheeks as Daniel pulled her into an embrace. For the first time in months, they sat together in silence, and it didn't feel suffocating. 2 days later, Daniel drove to his mother's house. The tiny home on the outskirts looked just the same. The faded wooden fence, the blooming bougainvillea, the old chair where they used to sit and watch the sunset together. In his hands, he carried a bouquet of white chrysanthemums and 2 cups of hot coffee. When the door opened, his mother's face appeared, calm, gentle, as if nothing had ever happened. "Your coffee's always the best, Mom," he said quietly, smiling, "but today I brought some of mine." She smiled and opened the door wider. "Well then, come in. Let's see if your coffee's any good compared to mine." They sat at the small kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the window, warming the steam rising from their cups. For a few minutes, neither spoke. Then Daniel set his cup down, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Mom." His words were soft but sincere. "I forgot who I was. I let fear and pride lead me too far away. You reminded me what home really means." She looked at him, smiling quietly. That's what mothers do, son. We remind you where home is, not to keep you here, but so you never forget where you came from. Daniel bowed his head, tears spilling down his cheeks. She reached out, took his hand, rough but warm, just like when he was a boy. That afternoon, Daniel stayed. They went out to the backyard, mended the old fence, swept up the fallen leaves, and laughed more than they had in months. As evening fell, they sat on the steps, watching the streetlights flicker on. Daniel said softly, "I'd forgotten what this feels like. Real peace." His mother replied, "Peace isn't found in fancy places. It's where someone's waiting for you to come home." A few days later, Margaret received a handwritten letter, the cursive lines delicate and slanted. "Dear Mother Margaret, thank you for holding up a mirror I was too afraid to look into. I've realized that all this time I wasn't fighting anyone else. I was fighting myself. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you, and thank you. Because even when it hurt, you still chose to tell me the truth. No one's ever been brave enough to do that for me. You were right. Real love can't be bought, and I promise I'll learn to give it, not display it." Veronica Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer where she kept Daniel's childhood notes. She felt no anger, no resentment, only a quiet smile, the kind that comes from watching a young person finally find their way back to themselves. That afternoon, as the world outside grew still, Margaret sat by the window, gazing into her garden. The bougainvillea petals fluttered softly in the breeze. Inside her heart, every wound had begun to fade, leaving behind only one truth. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the strength to love once more. That morning, the sky was clear and soft sunlight spilled gently across the small garden. Margaret stood in the kitchen, brewing a fresh pot of tea. The fragrance filled the house, warm and familiar. She set the teapot on the table, poured herself a cup, and sat by the window. Outside, the bougainvillea was in bloom, swaying in the breeze as if laughing. Her eyes drifted to the photo on the windowsill. Daniel as a boy, smiling brightly, holding a paper kite with both hands. The sunlight fell diagonally across his little face, casting a golden glow. A tender reminder that some things in life, no matter how many years pass, never truly change. Her inner voice spoke softly, yet clearly. Family isn't perfect dinners or expensive wine. It's forgiveness, laughter, and love that never checks the price tag. It's the place you can return to, even when you've lost yourself. She took a small sip of tea and smiled gently. Life went on, simple yet whole. No more anger, no more heavy words, only love, and the quiet faith that everything, eventually, will be all right. Daniel still visited every weekend. Sometimes Veronica came along, bringing homemade pastries. They didn't talk much about the past. Instead, they spoke of small things. A new movie, a flower blooming in the garden. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It had turned into peace, the kind that only exists between people who've been through pain and found their way back to love. Margaret exhaled slowly, her voice in her mind like a gentle parting message. Respecting those who came before us doesn't make us outdated. It keeps our roots alive, and kindness will never go out of style. She set her teacup down, her eyes still fixed on the garden, where sunlight poured over the leaves. A soft breeze drifted in, carrying the scent of flowers and the faint laughter of memory. If you've ever lived a story like this, if you've had to stand up again to forgive or to rediscover what family truly means, then subscribe to this channel. Because here, we share what truly matters: family, forgiveness, and the quiet courage it takes to tell the truth.